Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The silence between Obinna and Miriam after Ngozi's survival was heavier than any war declaration. The hospital recovery room was filled with medical beeps, hushed whispers from nurses, and occasional soft cries from Chisholm. But Obinna barely moved. He watched over Ngozi like a soldier guarding the last relic of peace. When the doctors declared her stable, he nodded solemnly, then returned to the villa. Not home, but the seat of surveillance. That night, he sat across the dining table from Miriam, who wore a sympathetic face and offered him his favorite meal. He smiled softly, eyes tired, and said, "Thank you, but I'm full already." Miriam chuckled, thinking it a joke, but when it continued every day, him refusing tea, wine, and snacks, she began to sense the shift. Obinna was polite but distant. He still kissed her cheek in front of staff, but there was no warmth in it. Something was unraveling beneath his calm expression, and it scared her more than any public scandal. Privately, Obinna had already begun to build his own shadow task force, men and women with no political ties, no budget trails, and no allegiance to anyone but him. He brought them in through private funds and housed them far from Aso Villa. Their mission was singular: trace the source of Ngozi's accident, expose the motive behind the Iduoma massacre, and dig into the growing suspicions around Miriam. Obinna gave them clear orders. Do not report to anyone but me. Not the cabinet. Not Security Council. If anyone asks who funds you, say God. Every day, while playing the part of the grieving yet responsible president, Obinna would secretly meet his agents in the garden behind the old guest wing of the villa, under cover of night. There they would share findings. One had traced a burner phone used during the accident to a staff member under Miriam's payroll. Another discovered logs showing last-minute changes to Chisholm's church security escort, a decision that came from the First Lady's office. Back inside the villa, Miriam sensed her husband slipping, but she underestimated the depth of his resolve. She increased her visits to Ngozi at the hospital, sometimes bringing Chisholm toys and calling the press to paint herself as the loving, forgiving wife. The media soaked it up. First Lady visits husband's secret family, a portrait of Grace, one headline read. But behind those staged photos and sugary smiles, Miriam's hands were still moving pieces. What she didn't know was that every visit, every transaction, every aide who whispered at her side was now under surveillance. Obinna no longer trusted the system around him. The peace he had governed with was replaced with a new resolve: justice without permission. His silence was not surrender, it was strategy. And Miriam, blind in her arrogance, still thought the war had ended. But in truth, it had only just begun. The private investigators Obinna assembled worked around the clock, combing through CCTV footage, combing data logs from the day of the attack, and tracking every communication line that pinged within the church's vicinity. On the third day, they uncovered something damning. A previously overlooked phone line had been active for just 7 minutes after the SUV crash. The number was registered under a false identity, but traced to a phone used by one of Miriam's domestic aides, a young man named Tund. Digging deeper, they found a message sent right before the crash: "Make sure the brake lines are done. I don't want a second chance." Obinna held the printed transcript in his hands for a long time. Dunladi, standing across from him, watched him breathe heavily. "We're close," Dunladi whispered. Obinna shook his head. "No, we're only beginning. This isn't just about Ngozi. This is about what they took from Iduoma. I want it all." The more they dug, the more the rot began to surface. Property deeds showed that large sections of land in Iduoma had quietly changed hands weeks before the massacre, sold at a pittance to shell companies linked to Chief Edom, Miriam's father. The supposed tribal war that killed hundreds was now looking more like a scripted purge. Obinna's stomach turned as he remembered the scorched fields, the burning homes, the blood on the streets. How could he have missed it? The answer was simple: love. He had loved Miriam too much to see her as a pawn. Now, with his heart open and his eyes clear, he saw the game. "They never wanted peace," he said quietly. "They wanted profit, and I was their perfect mask." Meanwhile, the ring on Ngozi's finger, the very one Obinna had given her before she disappeared, became more than a symbol of love. It became a promise renewed, that truth, though buried in oil and lies, would rise. Obinna knew he couldn't confront Miriam directly yet. He needed one final blow, one move that would destroy her ability to twist the narrative. He instructed Dinladi to leak carefully selected details to a few trusted journalists under pseudonyms. Nothing that pointed directly to the First Lady, but enough to shake the political table. Rumors swirled online. Was the Iduoma massacre engineered? New evidence suggests presidential cover-up. Obinna watched it all unfold from the shadows, waiting to see who would panic first. Sure enough, Miriam's movements increased. She began calling late-night meetings with her father, even traveling to Uche's residence under the guise of charity events. But now every whisper was recorded, every car tailed. Obinna no longer needed power to protect the truth. He had truth, and that was more powerful than the presidency itself. In the weeks that followed Ngozi's recovery, the walls of the presidential villa grew colder between Obinna and Miriam. The staff whispered about the growing tension, how the president now slept in the old guest chambers, how he never touched his wife's food, how even Chisholm avoided her presence. To the public, they remained a couple. But within the villa's gates, Obinna had begun the quiet unraveling of a marriage that had long lost its soul. Miriam tried everything, romantic gestures, tears, even faking a breakdown to get him to open up. But Obinna remained measured. He listened, but said little. The same man who once laughed over dinner with her now responded with nods and distant eyes. He wasn't angry, he was focused. That frightened her more than rage ever could. One evening, Miriam stood by the doorway as Obinna packed a small bag to stay at the Iduoma reconstruction site for a week. She walked in slowly, her voice laced with emotion. "You haven't touched me in months, Obinna. I'm still your wife." He turned, looked at her, not with hatred, but with heartbreaking clarity. "You were," he said softly, "but not anymore." Her lips quivered, but he walked past her and paused at the door. "You destroyed something sacred, Miriam. And now, I'm here to rebuild it, even if it means tearing down everything we once stood on." With that, he walked away, leaving Miriam staring at the empty room, her fists clenched and mind spiraling. She had underestimated the depth of the damage. She thought power would shield her from consequences. But now, the man she once manipulated was no longer playing defense. He was hunting truth. Outside the villa walls, the country began to sense the cracks. Social media buzzed with hints of a brewing scandal. Journalists who were once silenced now began publishing exposés. Anonymous sources cited corruption, manipulation, and secret meetings. Miriam made several public appearances, smiling and giving charity donations, but her eyes betrayed her fear. She knew the moment was near. She had made one mistake too many, and Obinna was no longer the lovesick husband or naive politician. He was a man on a mission, one who had lost too much to let evil hide behind family titles. And as the sun set over Abuja that evening, the wind carried a new scent, not of roses, not of perfume, but of war. It was nearly midnight when the first major breakthrough came. In a quiet operations room buried beneath an undisclosed safe house, Obinna's private agents, led by an ex-intelligence specialist named Ao, presented findings that turned stomachs. The man who drove Ngozi and Chisholm on the day of the attack wasn't just a replacement. He was a fugitive. His real identity was revealed through lifted fingerprints, tied to a previous massacre in the Northeast and suspected mercenary ties. His prison escape had been neatly buried in old files, the kind that would never be checked by any regular vetting process. Ao adjusted the projection on the screen and said firmly, this wasn't negligence. It was an insertion. Obinna's face hardened, fists clenched tightly behind his back as the room fell into silence. Dinladi stood beside him, breathing heavily, unable to process how deep the betrayal ran within the villa. The president finally turned around, pacing the room. Someone brought this man in. Someone inside, he said. I want names. And I want arrests. By the following morning, quiet detentions began across the presidential villa. Junior aides, kitchen staff, communications officers, anyone with links to Miriam's father or Senator Uche, were flagged. Internal chaos brewed, but Obinna remained silent in public, choosing instead to continue presenting an image of calm. Meanwhile, in the background, files were being pulled from every department, surveillance combed, and old data restored. When Ao returned later that evening, he brought damning intel. Two of the villa's longtime security personnel had served in Uche's private security company before they joined the presidential detail. Coincidence was ruled out. Obinna's shoulders drooped for a moment. "How long?" he murmured, not so much to anyone, but to himself. The betrayal wasn't just deep. It had been long, patient, calculating. These weren't accidents. They were decades of grooming and planting, all for a single goal: wealth through blood. As the reality set in, Obinna walked to the hospital once more, pausing briefly at Ngozi's door before entering. She was still asleep, recovering but stable. Chisholm sat beside her, coloring quietly, glancing up at his father with soft hope in his eyes. "Daddy, will Mummy be okay?" he asked. Obinna bent down and kissed the boy's forehead. "She will. Because the people who hurt her are running out of time." As he stood upright, a staff member approached nervously with a tray of lunch. Obinna chuckled dryly and waved it off. "I'm full," he said, smiling faintly, but the staff member froze. That phrase had now become a quiet code in the villa, a signal to Obinna's trusted circle. He wouldn't eat or drink anything unless he knew the source. The president had become a man cornered, but no longer blind. This was now a war of facts, loyalty, and survival. In a dusty archive in Port Harcourt, one of Obinna's most loyal agents, Nkem, uncovered a file that tore through the last veil of doubt. The Iduoma massacre had never been about ethnic conflict or religious strife as painted by the government years ago. It was a coordinated land grab cloaked in chaos. The file revealed land acquisition contracts signed between a shell company and the government barely 2 weeks after the killings. But deeper inspection traced the company's shares to none other than Chief Edom, Miriam's father. Worse, Senator Uche's signature was stamped across several transport approvals, rerouting federal military units that should have protected Iduoma's borders. The men who allowed innocent villagers to be slaughtered had done so for oil. Black gold. Profits buried beneath blood. When Nkem called Obinna, her voice trembled with rage. "Sir, they didn't just attack the people, they bought their silence." Obinna sat in his private study long after the call ended, staring at his hands. The weight of it all pressed down like a stone slab on his chest. He thought of every speech he'd given about unity, every policy on national security, every time he'd shaken the hands of men who knew exactly what they'd done. The people of Iduoma hadn't died in tribal hatred. They died because their soil was too rich for them to live. Obinna rose slowly and retrieved the old wedding ring from a drawer, a symbol of a love he'd nearly lost, born from a day that was supposed to bring joy but was turned into ashes. That same day, Ngozi had been kidnapped. That same day, the war had been ignited in his life. It all traced back to greed, greed masked as governance. "No more," he whispered. That night, in a secured briefing, Obinna shared the truth with Dunladi and Ao. He spoke with precision and clarity, each word delivered like a blade. "They didn't just betray a country. They desecrated my son's birth. They destroyed my people's homes. For profit." Dunladi bowed his head. "What now, sir?" Obinna leaned forward. "We bring it down, all of it. The names, the money trails, the contracts, the silence. I want the truth documented. I want it ready for the world. And I want them tried not just in court, but in the court of history." Then he turned to Ao. "We go to war, not with guns, but with truth." The clock was ticking for the betrayers. And this time, Obinna would be the fire that exposed every lie. It came wrapped in a yellow envelope, plain, clean, and left on the windshield of one of Obinna's unmarked vehicles. The note inside was chilling. "Leave the past buried, or Ngozi joins it." There was no signature, no DNA, no traceable print. Just ink and intimidation. When Ao placed the note on the president's table, Obinna didn't flinch. He read it twice, eyes narrowing with each word. Slowly, he pushed his chair back and stood, walking to the window, where the city glowed in quiet ignorance. "They think fear will make me stop," he said, voice low, nearly a growl. "They threaten my wife, my son, and now they threaten my love." He turned abruptly and slammed the envelope onto the table. "Then I will burn every wall they've built to hide their filth. And I will do it smiling." Dunladi watched him closely. "Sir, this could be from anyone. Are you sure we're ready to proceed openly?" Obinna raised his brow. "Ready? Dunladi, I was born in a village they tried to wipe off the map. I've buried friends. I've watched my woman bleed in my arms. I've seen my son almost stolen like a goat in the night. And they think they can still silence me." He slammed his fist on the table again. "Let them try. But I'll make this country too loud for them to hide." Obinna gave the order. Full media blackout until the investigation was complete. Internal suspension of all presidential staff pending security vetting. And immediate public engagement of an independent national legal committee to handle what was about to unfold. There would be no more guessing. No more mercy. That evening, while standing beside Ngozi's hospital bed, Obinna leaned down and whispered into her ear, "They try to take you from me. Again. But not this time, my love. Not this time." He looked at Chisholm, who was now sketching drawings of a family in front of a house. A house that Obinna hadn't yet built, but would. Ao entered quietly and handed Obinna a small folder. Inside were names. Dozens. People who had known. People who had benefited. Obinna took the folder, kissed Ngozi's hand, and stepped outside. "Tell the Attorney General," he said. "I'm ready to bury them, with the law as my shovel." It began with whispers, small irregularities in Chisholm's school routine. His teacher noted that an unfamiliar woman had come to pick him up before, claiming to be a family assistant. Obinna's newly deployed secret agents, trained to monitor even the smallest details, flagged it immediately. At first, Obinna hoped it was nothing. But by the time a coded message was intercepted between Miriam's personal aide and an unknown group using burner phones, it became undeniable. Something sinister was underway. Obinna gathered the intel in his private study, heart pounding, hands trembling. He stared at a blurry screenshot from CCTV footage that showed a masked man inspecting Chisholm's school gate. It was no longer just about political betrayal or personal vengeance. It had crossed a sacred line. His son, the boy who bore his name and carried the blood of the only woman who had ever truly loved him. Obinna gave the command, "Let them go through with it, but don't let them touch my son." The trap was set. On a clouded Thursday morning, Chisholm was scheduled to attend a small civic workshop outside the presidential villa. His security detail had already been swapped silently with Obinna's loyal agents. When the black minibus with tinted windows arrived, no alarms were raised. It had all the right clearances. Chisholm, smiling, was escorted out by a female agent posing as his teacher. Within minutes, a suspicious car began tailing them. The agents knew what was coming. At a checkpoint, 2 armed men stepped out, demanding that the boy be handed over. But they didn't know that every angle of the ambush was being recorded by drones circling above. A brief firefight broke out. 2 agents were wounded. One kidnapper was shot in the leg, and the other was tackled to the ground while trying to flee. The shock came when one of the agents discovered a transfer slip for over 20 million Nigerian nairas from an account linked to Miriam's aide. Even worse, inside the kidnapper's pocket was a locket with Chisholm's baby photo, one only someone close to the family could have provided. That same night, Obinna sat alone in the dark, re-watching the footage. He could barely breathe, his chest heaving in silent fury. When Dunladi entered, Obinna spoke just once. It was never about Ngozi alone. Her hatred extends beyond reason. They both understood what had to happen. Miriam's madness had escalated beyond political manipulation or emotional warfare. She had endangered a child. That was her final sin. With precision and no warning, Obinna signed the order. An immediate covert operation to arrest the First Lady. No press. No spectacle. Just justice. That night, as the villa slept, black-suited agents entered through the staff wing. Miriam was in her prayer room, rehearsing her next televised fasting for the nation's speech. She looked up and smiled when she saw the men, until she saw the handcuffs. "What's the meaning of this?" she hissed, rising in fury. The lead agent replied, "By order of the president, you are under arrest for conspiracy to kidnap and attempted murder." Her scream echoed through the halls. The arrest of the First Lady sent shockwaves across the country, though the event was kept off the mainstream news for the first 12 hours. Inside the villa, the mood shifted from tension to disbelief. Staff whispered as they watched furniture being removed from Miriam's wing. Her wardrobe was sealed, and her private office was cleared. Obinna remained silent. He did not address the media, nor did he attend briefings for 2 days. He spent that time beside Chisholm, watching him sleep and contemplating the years he had sacrificed for a marriage built on performance and diplomacy. Ngozi, still recovering, called his name softly from her hospital bed, and he went to her side. "Did she hurt him?" she asked weakly. Obinna kissed her forehead. "She tried. But we stopped her. I won't let anyone come near you again, not even a first lady." That declaration would become the turning point, the moment the president abandoned public opinion in favor of truth. Behind closed doors, Obinna summoned a secret cabinet meeting. No reporters, no aides loyal to past regimes. He walked in not wearing the presidential sash, but a plain navy blue suit and a folder marked betrayal. His voice, when he spoke, cut like iron. "I will not lead a government that shelters murderers, thieves, or the bitter-hearted." He announced the quiet dismissal of every senior staffer linked to Chief Edom, Senator Uche, and the faction that had supported Miriam's rise to prominence. "We rebuild from ashes," he said, "and I will start with people who remember what it's like to live in them." Over the next few hours, confidential phone calls were made. New appointments rolled in, men and women from Iduoma, from villages left behind, from families who had lost something in the massacre. A quiet revolution began that day. The era of polished lies was coming to an end. The world watched, confused and intrigued. Rumors swirled. Was the First Lady ill? Was there a coup? Was the president retiring? None of the answers came. But that silence was its own thunder. Meanwhile, protests began to swell. The arrest of Miriam leaked on social media, and within hours, crowds gathered outside Senator Uche's gated mansion in Lagos. Angry youths painted blood for oil on his walls, chanting for justice. Journalists were chased out with stones as community members demanded the truth about Iduoma. In the capital, foreign diplomats requested meetings. Obinna declined them all. He had bigger plans. This was no longer about optics. This was personal. The throne was already cracked, and the man who once wore the crown was about to turn it into a sword. It was just after midnight when the gates of the presidential villa creaked open, and 2 unmarked black SUVs rolled out. Inside one of them sat the former First Lady, Miriam Edom, her hands cuffed, her expression vacant. Gone was the graceful smile, the calculated charm. Her scarf hung loosely around her neck, and for the first time in years, there were no cameras to document her tears. She stared out the tinted glass, the lights of Abuja flickering like the remains of the power she once held. In the other vehicle, Miriam's father, Chief Edom, sat with his head bowed, already calling in favors to judges, senators, and media houses. But he underestimated the weight of what had been uncovered. The president had outmaneuvered them, and this time there would be no escaping justice. The convoy headed for a secure holding facility where a full commission awaited their testimony. But what was about to unfold would echo across every screen in Nigeria. The morning news finally broke the silence. Breaking: First Lady and Chief Edom arrested in connection to kidnap plot and Iduoma massacre. Images from the villa leaked to the press, Miriam being escorted out by agents, her hands behind her back. Obinna was nowhere in sight. He didn't need to be. The nation erupted. Market squares played radio broadcasts at full volume. Churches held impromptu vigils. Parents hugged their children. The headlines were clear. A president chose the people over power. Senator Uche, seeing his empire collapsing, attempted to flee the country. But at the Port Harcourt airport, Local youths blocked the runway in protest. "You stole our blood," they screamed. Security had to escort him back to custody. His mansion was defaced, torched in places, and marked forever as a symbol of greed and betrayal. He was no longer a senator. He was a man haunted by his sins. Back at the villa, Obinna stood in the garden outside the West Wing, watching the sunset with tears in his eyes. Dunladi approached quietly. "Sir, the commission is ready. Public inquiry will begin in 2 days." Obinna didn't answer right away. He touched the band on his wrist, the ring Ngozi had returned to him in the hospital. "Let them see everything," he finally said. "The papers, the contracts, the blood money. I don't want mercy. I want truth." His voice was low but firm. "And when this is over, Dunladi, we start again. Not as kings, but as servants of the people." For the first time in weeks, he smiled, not out of joy, but relief. The throne they had tried to hijack was no longer theirs to hold. And as Obinna turned to walk back inside, the wind carried with it a quiet promise. This was no longer just a presidency. It was a reckoning. When Obinna stepped onto the stage that evening, the silence across the nation was heavier than thunder. No fanfare, no anthem. Just the sound of a leader whose eyes had seen more betrayal than most could imagine. He stood before a somber crowd in a plain navy blue outfit, his wedding ring glinting under the lights, and a photograph of Ngozi and Chisholm placed delicately beside the podium. Every television across the country carried the image live. Cafes, hospital rooms, street corners, even prison cells tuned in. Obinna didn't read from a speech. He didn't use a teleprompter. His voice cracked as he began. "I am not here as your president tonight," he said slowly. "I am here as a man who was lied to. A man whose family was nearly erased. A man who once chose silence and paid for it." His hands trembled as he held up the threat letter he had received, proof of how deep the evil ran. "I loved someone," he continued. "They tried to bury her, and my son too, so they could wear crowns made from oil and blood." His voice rose. "But I swear tonight, I will bury their ambitions with truth." As he spoke, the camera cut to multiple locations across the country. Crowds in Iduoma wept openly. In Lagos, some stood with hands on their chests. In prison, former staffers of Miriam, who had been arrested for treasonous acts, buried their faces in shame. Obinna's raw grief transcended politics. "The massacre in Iduoma," he said, "was not a tribal war. It was a business decision. They created fake enemies, removed security, and signed contracts with foreign oil companies before the first coffin was sealed." He named names: Senator Uche, Chief Edom, and even Miriam, his wife. The hall gasped when he added, "And while I was burying soldiers, they were acquiring licenses to dig beneath graves." Obinna's voice became almost a whisper. "You voted for a man. They tried to make me a puppet. They failed." He lifted his head. "I don't want your applause. I want justice. And I don't need permission to find it." By the time he stepped down from the podium, the entire country was shaken. Hashtags exploded online. Hashtag not just a president. Hashtag justice for Iduoma. Hashtag blood for oil. Even foreign dignitaries issued quiet statements of support. But Obinna wasn't looking for support anymore. As he walked backstage, Dunladi approached with a new batch of forensic evidence: fingerprints, phone records, emails that tied together a web of conspirators who had planned not just Iduoma, but multiple displacements over the years. Obinna nodded slowly. "Start the arrests. Don't wait till morning." That night, while the world watched his tears, his soldiers and agents, quiet, strategic, moved. In a span of 6 hours, 27 individuals connected to the conspiracy were taken in. It wasn't just a speech, it was a war declaration, and the nation had chosen its side. In the war room inside the secured quarters of the presidential villa, maps were pinned, names were linked with red thread, and walls were now covered with evidence that spanned over 5 years. Obinna stood in the center of it all like a man reborn, not in rage, but in resolution. Dunladi narrated, pointing to clusters of dates and signatures. The massacre was planned 2 months in advance. This company, he pointed, Hydromex Energy Ltd., fronted by a shell corporation in Dubai, was used by Chief Edom to negotiate the oil rights of Iduoma land. Obinna stared at the documents. There were signed military withdrawal memos, bank transactions leading from Miriam's private account to anonymous mercenary cells, and signed parliamentary endorsements secured with bribes. It was all there, clear, undeniable. They sold our people for barrels, Obinna muttered, the room deathly quiet. The deeper the investigators dug, the more horrifying the details became. Contract had been signed with foreign oil firms just days after the massacre, giving exclusive rights to drill under what was declared unclaimed territory. Survivors' properties were reclassified as federal land due to displacement. It was a crime of precision, covered in layers of legality and blanketed with lies. What shocked Obinna most was not the level of corruption, but how close it had lived beside him for years. Miriam had been his partner, his political support, his public comfort, and yet she had funded the very chaos that kept him restless for years. They called me weak, Obinna said, tapping on Senator Uche's signature. They thought I wouldn't look behind the curtain. But now I'll burn the curtain down. Public reaction was swift. Leaks from the evidence room began circulating. Youths staged vigils at Iduoma with lanterns and protest signs reading "Justice delayed is genocide." Former soldiers broke their silence and began confessing how they were pulled back days before the massacre. Obinna, meanwhile, called in legal experts to prepare charges: genocide, abuse of power, conspiracy, and high treason. He removed immunity clauses in their cases with a presidential executive order. Let no title protect guilt, he said. International bodies like Amnesty International and the ICC offered support. For the first time in decades, Nigeria was not looking away from its pain. It was embracing it, holding it up to the light, and choosing to heal, not forget. Miriam sat in the courtroom dressed in white, her face bare, lips pale, and hair tied back in a silent braid. Her eyes scanned the gallery where Obinna sat beside Chisholm and Ngozi, three people she had tried to erase. The judge called her case: attempted kidnapping, conspiracy to murder, treasonous sabotage of state security, and obstruction of justice. She rose, trying to present herself as composed, but her voice cracked. I was trying to save my home, she said. He was leaving me for her. Murmurs spread through the gallery. Obinna didn't flinch. Ngozi kept her eyes on her lap. Chisholm hugged his mother tightly. Miriam's lawyer tried to paint her as a heartbroken wife manipulated by her father and political pressure, but the court wasn't moved. The footage of her aide handing cash to the attempted kidnappers was too damning. Her bitterness had crossed into criminality. When confronted with the payment records, Miriam sobbed uncontrollably. I thought if she left, he'd come back to me, she confessed. But the courtroom remained cold. The judge, an elderly woman with a strong voice, leaned forward and asked, at what point does heartbreak justify abduction? Or murder? Was it heartbreak, or was it power? Miriam couldn't answer. She collapsed into her seat, weeping. As more evidence was presented, emails she sent to Senator Uche, her voice on wiretaps coordinating false media campaigns against Ngozi. Even her own bodyguard testified under immunity. Miriam had thought she was untouchable. But now she was just another criminal on trial. The courtroom was a theater of truth, and the nation was watching. Outside, public opinion was volatile. Some felt pity for Miriam, recalling the First Lady who once stood beside the president during his rise. But most were enraged. She didn't just want power, one survivor said to a journalist. She wanted Ngozi dead. She wanted our stories erased. Obinna remained quiet throughout the trial. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't tweet. He simply watched, with pain and resolve in his eyes. Miriam had once danced at his inaugural ball. Now, she awaited sentencing in a cold holding cell, stripped of titles, stripped of marriage, and left only with the echoes of what her hatred had cost her. As she was led away in cuffs, the gavel fell, and the nation held its breath for what would come next. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Thousands more watched from the streets via large mounted screens. The air in Abuja was tense, like a city holding its breath. After weeks of gripping testimony, damning revelations, and public outcry, it was time. The courtroom fell silent as the judge entered, her robes swaying with the weight of justice. Obinna sat with his hand gently wrapped around Ngozi's fingers, while Chisholm sat between them, clutching his father's coat. Across the aisle sat Chief Edom, Senator Uche, and Miriam, all awaiting the judgment that would seal their fates. Chief Edom, once a business mogul hailed as a philanthropist, now looked smaller than life, buried in shame. Senator Uche's arrogance had withered into dread, and Miriam, Obinna's once beloved First Lady, kept her head bowed, her white outfit soaked with tears she no longer bothered to wipe. The judge's voice was clear and steady as she read the sentences. Chief Edom, guilty on all counts: mass conspiracy, economic sabotage, funding of civilian massacres, life imprisonment without parole. The gavel hit once. A ripple moved through the room. Senator Uche, guilty of aiding and abetting genocide, using political office to influence state withdrawal and suppress truth. Life imprisonment. Another bang. Then came the name that had broken hearts and divided a nation. Miriam Edom Obinna, First Lady of the Federal Republic. She paused. Miriam slowly lifted her eyes. Guilty of conspiracy to kidnap, attempted murder, interference with state investigation, and betrayal of national trust. Considering your psychological profile, first offense, and lack of direct massacre involvement, 15 years imprisonment. Miriam let out a sob. Ngozi's eyes welled with tears, not of pity, but relief. Obinna nodded solemnly. It was over. Outside the courtroom, chaos erupted. Angry youths marched to Senator Uche's estate, pelting it with stones and paint-marked blood for oil. His security fired warning shots into the air, but it only fueled the fury. Ngozi's name trended online once again, this time as a symbol of survival. International news outlets praised Obinna's graceful yet relentless pursuit of justice. Commentators compared the courtroom to a battlefield of moral reckoning. But inside the heart of the president, there was no celebration, only the heavy satisfaction of knowing he had fulfilled a vow. He had promised Ngozi that her pain would not be wasted. He had promised Chisholm a future without shadows. And now he had delivered. As they exited the court, cameras flashing, Obinna did not wave or speak. He simply placed his arm around Ngozi and whispered to her softly, "Now we can breathe again." Days after the sentencing, the country began to settle into a new rhythm. Though the scars from Iduoma and the betrayal of the presidency were far from healed, a new air of accountability had swept across government offices and communities. Ministers who had been silent during the crisis began tendering resignations. Obinna, though still president, began spending more time in Iduoma with Ngozi and Chisholm. The people welcomed him not as a leader, but as a son who returned. And in that quiet place where so much blood had been spilled, he found the courage to do what he had waited over a decade to do. At dusk, in front of the old church that had been rebuilt by community hands, Obinna knelt on one knee. In his hand was the same ring Ngozi had returned to him years ago. "This time I want to finish what I started," he said, his voice shaking. "Will you marry me, not for politics, not for headlines, but because I've never stopped loving you?" Ngozi's eyes filled with tears. Her lips trembled. For a moment, the years of pain, betrayal, and silence flashed through her mind. She remembered that night at the border, the ring on her finger as gunfire rang behind them. She remembered hiding in slums, giving birth to Chisholm alone, and selling charcoal just to feed him. And yet, here he was, kneeling not as a president, but as the man who once promised her forever. She bent down, cupped his cheek, and nodded. "Yes," she whispered. But this time, no more goodbyes. The crowd that had quietly gathered behind them erupted into cheers. Chisholm, watching with joy, ran to them and placed the ring in his father's palm, the same one he had worn as a necklace for years. "Make her smile forever," he said. And Obinna, eyes filled with tears, did just that. The engagement wasn't announced on national television. There were no exclusive interviews or magazine spreads. The only photograph released was one taken by a local teenage girl, Ngozi barefoot, Obinna kneeling in front of her, Chisholm standing beside them holding both their hands. The picture became an image of healing. Youths printed it on shirts with the words, "Love survived." For the first time in years, Nigeria didn't just have a president. It had a story, a testimony, and that ring, which had traveled through war, loss, and redemption, had finally found its home. The wedding was not grand. It wasn't held in Asa Rock or in the National Cathedral. Instead, it was set in the heart of Iduoma, inside the same church that had been reduced to ashes during the massacre and rebuilt by the hands of villagers. The guest list included survivors, children orphaned by the massacre, market women who once gave Ngozi scraps of food, and the teachers who taught Obinna before he ever became anyone important. There were no ministers or governors in suits, just ordinary people in colorful wrappers, lace blouses, and agbatas worn with pride. Ngozi walked down the aisle barefoot, her dress simple but regal, stitched by a widow who had lost both sons in the massacre. Her veil was sewn from white net bought at the village market, and as she stepped toward Obinna, who waited with trembling hands, the entire country watched through live streams, not as citizens of a republic, but as witnesses of a love that refused to die. Obinna wore a simple cream agbada, no gold embroidery, no medals or sashes, just his presidential ring and Chisholm standing proudly beside him in matching attire. The ceremony was conducted by a local pastor who had once offered Ngozi a place to hide during her exile. "What God allows to break," he said, "he often uses to rebuild the strongest homes." When they exchanged vows, Obinna looked her in the eye and said, "This time I vow not just with my words, but with every decision, every silence I choose to break, and every truth I will defend." Ngozi, holding back tears, replied, "This time I walk with you as your equal, not in your shadow, but beside you, not as a survivor, but as your wife." When they kissed, the entire congregation stood. People clapped, wept, and praised aloud. No one sat still. Even the wind outside seemed to whisper, "Amen." Afterward, the reception took place outside the church under woven palm canopies. There was roasted yam, jollof rice, native soups, and joyful dancing that continued until nightfall. Chisholm gave a small speech, thanking his mother for never giving up and his father for choosing truth. "This is not just their wedding," he said. "It's our beginning." A small wooden sign stood at the entrance of the village that read, "Iduoma, the land that rose again." And as night fell, Obinna and Ngozi sat hand in hand watching children play with fireflies under the stars. No army, no convoy, no security, just peace. And for the first time in years, the ring that never left her hand now glowed in celebration, not of survival, but of a future reclaimed. Obinna stood beneath the rising sun of Iduoma, now reborn with the breath of hope. After the wedding, he had remained in the village, not as a president wielding executive orders, but as a son of the soil walking the red earth that had once cried blood. The reconstruction of Iduoma wasn't just infrastructure, it was spiritual. New homes were rising not with government contractors, but with local artisans paid fair wages. Boreholes that had run dry now flowed again. Women once widowed by political greed were appointed to lead cooperatives managing farming grants. And at the heart of it all was the church, no longer a ruin, but a monument of survival. Obinna walked the streets every morning without guards, holding hands with children, listening to the laughter of people who once had nothing to laugh about. "This land bled," he said to the village elders, "but I won't let anyone else make it bleed again." One of the most radical moves he made was halting all oil drilling activities on Iduoma's land until a newly formed community council, made up solely of local residents, decided how and if resources should be extracted. The council included widows, youth leaders, environmental scholars, and religious representatives. Obinna's decree shocked business magnates across the country and infuriated oil investors abroad. But he didn't flinch. "You took enough," he said in a press conference. "Now they get to choose." Reporters asked if this was emotional governance. He replied, "If you've never seen your home turn into a graveyard, then don't lecture me about emotion." That single response sparked a movement. Other regions began demanding community oversight of land use. Obinna didn't just rebuild Iduoma. He shook the structure of exploitative leadership from the grassroots to also rock. At night, Obinna and Ngozi would sit beneath the mango tree in front of their new home, once a thatched hut, now a restored bungalow wrapped in wildflowers. They didn't speak much, but their silence was rich. Chisholm often played nearby with children his age, now no longer in hiding or fear. One evening, as the wind blew softly, Ngozi said, "You kept your promise." Obinna looked at her, weary but content. "I didn't," he replied. "But I'm trying to become the man I was before they took you from me." In the stillness of the moment, she rested her head on his shoulder. Their wounds hadn't disappeared, but they had become bridges, connecting the past to the future, trauma to healing. Iduoma had risen not as a town, but as a symbol, a quiet declaration that those once forgotten could still write history with their scars. Back in Abuja, the ripple effect of Obinna's transformation reached the core of the nation's legal system. One of his first acts was signing an executive bill that revoked immunity from corruption for all sitting public officials. Gone were the days when ministers and governors could hide behind office while looting the country blind. The National Assembly pushed back hard. Some even accused him of authoritarianism. But Obinna stood firm, stating on record, "If your office protects you from prison more than it protects the people from poverty, then your office is useless." The bill passed after heated debates and massive youth protests in support. Overnight, Nigeria witnessed what was once unthinkable. Powerful individuals who once walked like gods were summoned for audits, inquiries, and prosecutions. Fear changed sides. Justice had awakened. Obinna also restructured the judiciary appointment process. He disbanded the old advisory council known for nepotism and replaced it with a diverse panel, half of whom were grassroots legal activists, youth advocates, and women who had served communities with little recognition. He visited law schools, urging young lawyers to defend the powerless, not sponsor their oppressors. Courtrooms began to fill with victims who had once been too poor or scared to speak. Old land grab cases were reopened. Political prisoners were reviewed and, in many cases, released. For the first time in decades, judges delivered rulings without whispering who was watching. The people began to trust the courts again, not because the buildings changed, but because the people inside them finally did. Meanwhile, a quiet moment in Obinna's office revealed the core of his resolve. He stood at the window, watching the Capitol swirl in late evening traffic. Dunladi entered and placed 2 sealed files on his desk, evidence from corruption investigations into men Obinna had once admired, some even mentored. "Should we proceed, sir?" Dunladi asked. Obinna took a long breath. "Let truth be consistent, even if it kills memory." That night, his heart was heavy, but his conscience was light. He knew that true justice was not just punishing enemies, but refusing to protect friends from it. It was in those moments of costly fairness that Obinna's presidency stopped being powerful and became honorable. The same system that once turned against him, he now bent toward righteousness, not for applause, but for legacy. With the old order dismantled, Obinna set his eyes on something far more difficult: rebuilding government from scratch. Instead of selecting political loyalists or party financiers, he opened national applications for cabinet appointments. Across the country, young professionals, teachers, small-scale business owners, nurses, and market coordinators sent in their credentials. Obinna read many of the files himself. "I want people who wept in hospital queues," he told the selection board. "I want people who know what it means to walk a mile in broken sandals." For the first time, a woman from the northern farming belt was appointed Minister of Agriculture. A young man who once taught under a tree in Borno became Minister of Education. Activists became advisors. Engineers, not politicians, headed the Ministry of Works. The cabinet looked less like a political family and more like the nation it served. The change was not without backlash. Critics screamed that he was dismantling experience. But Obinna had lived through the consequences of experience without empathy. "I've seen what seasoned corruption looks like," he said to reporters. "Let's try seasoned sacrifice." Meetings changed. Ministers met not in luxury halls, but in community spaces once ignored. Their performance was evaluated not by how many trips they made, but how many villages gained access to water, schools, and health centers. Monthly transparency bulletins were printed and shared publicly. Governors who failed to comply were summoned live on national television. Obinna wasn't just leading a team. He was proving a new governance culture was possible. Not perfect, but possible. Ngozi watched it all quietly, proud yet cautious. She often reminded him to rest, to eat, to breathe. "You're doing what they said couldn't be done," she said one night. "But don't forget, you're still human." Obinna smiled, placing his hand over hers. "If I fall again, let it be for standing where they thought no one would." In their bedroom, Chisholm read aloud from a civics textbook, asking questions about justice, about power, about love. And in every answer Obinna gave, there was a glimpse of the leader Nigeria had waited decades for, a man who had been broken, buried, betrayed, but chose to rise not with vengeance, but vision. The new cabinet was more than a political strategy. It was a rebirth of national purpose, etched in pain, sealed with truth, and driven by love. The hall was quiet, not the silence of absence, but the silence of reverence. It was Obinna's final day as president, and the entire nation stood still. Unlike the ornate ceremonies of past leaders, Obinna chose a plain white native attire, no agbada, no gold embroidery, no red carpet. His wedding ring gleamed gently on his hand, and beside him stood a framed photo, Ngozi and Chisholm, smiling in the new garden of Iduoma. Obinna stepped up to the podium, not with grandiose language or flowery promises, but with eyes filled with emotion. He began, "Once I stood before you as a man broken by war, power, and loss. Today I stand before you not as a perfect man, but a whole one." The audience listened, many already in tears. "You gave me power," he continued, "but I learned that power without people is just a crown of loneliness." In his address, Obinna spoke not just of policies, but of people, of mothers who had fed him when he was on campaign trails, of children whose villages were leveled for oil, of Ngozi's resilience, of Chisholm's questions about justice. He admitted his faults. He mourned those he couldn't save. And he praised the unsung heroes, the private investigators, whistleblowers, market women, and farmers who rose against fear. "Iduoma is no longer a grave," he said, voice cracking. "It is proof that even the forgotten can rise again." He didn't announce a successor with pride, but with a hopeful plea. Don't just choose who speaks the best. Choose who listens to the broken. He closed his speech with a deep bow, not as a politician, but as a man who had finally come full circle. And the hall erupted not in applause, but in weeping. Outside, thousands stood in the sun, watching the broadcast on screens. Old men who had lost sons during the massacre wept openly. Children waved cardboard signs that read, "Thank you, Papa Chisholm." In the crowd, youth leaders from Iduoma handed out bottled water, and flyers reading "Never Again." Ngozi stood at the back of the hall, hands clutched to her chest, tears running freely down her cheeks. Chisholm, dressed in a miniature version of his father's outfit, leaned against her. "Is Daddy still president?" he asked. Ngozi knelt beside him. "Not anymore," she whispered, smiling through her tears. "But he'll always be your hero." As the sun dipped lower, a gentle breeze blew through the flags surrounding the capital. It wasn't the end of an era. It was the crowning of something deeper, a healed soul, a redeemed people, a redefined power. The village of Iduoma buzzed gently that morning, not with politics or mourning, but with quiet celebration. Flowers adorned the newly built school gates, a clean water borehole gurgled steadily near the clinic, and villagers gathered around to watch a special ceremony unfold. At the heart of the rebuilt town stood a small garden planted by Obinna himself. It held a single tree, a native ogbono tree, beneath which he had buried a time capsule, filled with items that told the story of their pain and triumph. Ngozi walked into the garden wearing a modest wrapper and scarf, no makeup, no cameras, just grace. The same silver ring, the one she had worn all these years through suffering and silence, remained on her finger. She sat beneath the tree and whispered, "We survived, my love, even when they tried to erase us." Obinna soon joined her, dressed simply. He knelt in the dirt and dug a small hole with his bare hands. Into it, he placed a folded copy of his resignation speech, a photograph of the victims of Iduoma, and a handwritten letter titled, "For Chisholm, when he turns 18. Then he covered it up and planted new wildflowers at the base. Ngozi touched his hand, tears rolling freely. "You never stopped wearing your ring either," she said. He looked at her, eyes red. "Because I was never married to anyone else in my heart." Chisholm ran toward them, his little feet kicking up dust, laughing as he threw his arms around them both. In that moment, no throne, no palace, no gold in sight. The former president of Nigeria found the one thing his enemies never wanted him to have: peace. As the villagers sang softly and played drums, Obinna held Ngozi's hand high before the crowd. No announcements, no speeches, just unity. Behind them, the new primary school had been named after Chisholm's late grandmother. Across from the garden stood a rebuilt community hall for village decisions, no longer controlled by external powers, but led by elected villagers. A statue of a woman holding a ring stood at the entrance, carved from stone salvaged after the massacre. Beneath it were words in 3 languages: love, truth, never forgotten. As the sun set over Iduoma, casting golden rays over the land that once bled, Obinna lifted Chisholm into his arms and whispered, "This is yours now. Guard it with truth." And in that quiet sunset, the people didn't chant, didn't scream. They just stood and watched and wept with joy. Because even after betrayal, war, and loss, the ring never left her hand, and the story ended in victory. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.